is to discuss the methodology of stock flow consistent models and CGE models in order to make a comparison. So the motivation started because now the interest for modelers is concentrated on the ecological transition, the energy transition, and so on and so forth. And this requires some more detail on the structural characteristics of production, and therefore input-output tables. On the other hand, there is a growing understanding among all economists that you cannot separate the analysis of real markets from the analysis of financial markets because there are strong interactions. And this became very much apparent with the 2009 crisis, also for mainstream economists. And this also gave more relevance to the post-Keynesian stock flow consistent model, which were able to predict the 2009 crisis and therefore came to the attention. So the problem with the stock flow consistent models is that so far they were developed for a whole country, their empirical part, and without any disaggregation of production among industries, and models were demand-driven. And therefore, we have to discuss what would happen when you introduce an input-output structure in many industries. On the other hand, computable general equilibrium models have been used for many years to analyze problems like the ecological transition, etc. They come from a different tradition. They are usually very much linked with maximization and microeconomic foundation, but as I will discuss, there is a variety of such models. The point is that when you introduce an input-output structure into stock flow models, then and a financial structure into CGE models, you can basically covering the same markets with different perspectives. So it becomes interesting to discuss whether the two approaches are, may converge or may coexist in the future. So I think I have to go very quickly, and most of you know everything already about what I will say on the historical evolution. So basically, CGE started from input-output models, which were expanded by Richard Stone to social accounting matrices and the adoption of the multiplier connected to the sums, and then the fixed coefficients of the sums of the input-output was addressed by CGE modelers, which introduced some kind of theory of maximization to allow for changes in these technical coefficients. And you can see from these are quotes from a 1996 book that, as we know, mainstream think that economic theory is about maximization. So if you do a model with data without maximization, many people say this is not economics, while you need to have maximization to have economic theory applied data. So this is the shift which was discussed when the Chaos Commission type Keynesian models were attacked. We had a look at it, and I don't think I have time to discuss this now within the Q&A. So CGE were used in the 1960s, were abandoned because of the prominence of Keynesian models after the 70s. When in the 70s, with the oil shocks and other problems, Keynesian models were under attack. CGE had again prominence. And it is recognized that one of the reasons for the success of CGE was the standardization of softwares and databases which allowed new young researchers to enter into this community without addressing these large fixed costs of having to construct your database and having the full set of accounting identities. So one of the suggestions from this historical part that my co-author came with is that stock flow consistent models have not gone through a similar approach. And actually there are two maybe competing approaches. One is the pursued mainly by Marco Passarella, who's here, and he has done considerable work using R, which is a free software, using the Eurostat database, which can be easily addressed with R code. So his work, or the work he has done using this approach, has the advantage that other people can easily replicate his work for other countries. What my experience suggests, and what we have written also with Francesco, is that yes, you have some gains if you have the cake half baked, but stock flow consistent models are mainly about understanding the economy you are working with, checking whether the data has enough quality to be reliable, and so on. So in my experience, when you look at the data for a country, you learn a lot which is not apparent, is not well known. For instance, I've been working for a long time on Greece with Greek co-authors. At one point I told my co-authors, look, I think the Greek government purchased a lot of weapons in a period of austerity. My co-author said, no, this is not possible. After 6 months, it became, it was published in the newspaper. This is exactly what they did. And you could find, because the imports and the investment were jumping up in the same way. So if you had already the code and the data, you never notice this type of shocks. But if you have to construct your database and check if it is consistent, then you will find, you learn a lot about the economics. You can discuss this later. So here is a short history of SFC. I think most of you know about the history of SFC. So I can skip that and come back to this if you have questions in the Q&A. Just for a few of you who know nothing about SFC, the key features are that there is a horizontal consistency constraint that implies that for every payment you have who is paying, who is receiving the money. A second consistency requirement is that for each payment you have to have a change in some financial assets or liabilities or both. So these two will imply the quadruple entry accounting, which is a requisite of consistency. Then with these matrices, you have a full representation of the flows. In order to get the balance sheet, you have to take into account the capital gains, so the increase in the value of your assets due to changes in the market price. And this is one of the things that I believe is missing completely from CGE models, for reasons I hope we'll be able to discuss. Once you add the flows of borrowing and lending to the capital gains or losses, you can compute the dynamics of the balance sheet for real financial assets at the end of the period. After that, the end of period balance sheets will have implication for your future behavior. So if you have debt, you have to pay interest on this debt. If you have capital output target, this capital output will impact your investment decisions in the future, and so on. So all this should be consistency requirements that any macroeconomic model should have. In the literature, however, most of the authors, if not all, have adopted a post-Keynesian approach to the closures, so to the theory we adopt to endogenize whatever is not explained by accounting requirements. And in empirical models, we usually adopt error correction mechanisms. So the idea is that there is a long-run attractor of some sort, and in stock flow models, it's usually the requirement that stock-to-flow ratio have to converge to a stable value when the economy is on a stable growth path. But in the short run, you are not on target, and you adjust to the target through time, and the adjustment is usually quite slow. So usually we can start either from a transaction matrix, but that is not easy to compare to CGE, but the SAM, the social accounting matrix, is exactly what you would have in a CGE. So basically in standard SFC, you don't have the input-output matrix, you only have one sector producing everything. But this shows clearly how you can expand the model by having more industries. And here you define income distribution, transfer saving, all in a consistent way. Then from these accounting constraints, you get the net lending of each sector. The net lending can be decomposed in changes in assets and liabilities. So these are the standard distinction of assets we have in the accounting. The problem that you need to address when you build an empirical model is that all of this is published by basically all advanced economists. All advanced economists publish the data more or less in the format I'm using here, but most of the time they do not match the payer to payee or the debtor to the creditor. So this would require some work from the modeler to do the additional constraint. Are these net capital gains important? So I mentioned before that they're usually ignored in CGE models, and they're pretty important. So this is a chart I did yesterday from the US integrated macroeconomic accounts. The blue line is the net capital gains of US households on their homes, and the orange line is the US household net capital gains on their equities. So you can see that in 2009, actually a little before 2009, you had a drop in these capital gains, which was over 30% of their disposable income. So obviously this has a major role in a crisis. And actually, I also learned yesterday something I didn't notice before, that in 2022, last year, we had a fall in the value of equities, which was even worse than that of 2009. Why didn't the economy crash? Well, because in the previous 2 years, US households have gained 6 trillions with their appreciation of their equities. Now they lost, I think, 2.5 trillion. But if you had a very large increase in your stock market values and then drops, okay. I don't want to discuss this right here. So anyway, we get to the balance sheet by adding these capital gains, and this is how we have the full stock flow model. So finally to the start of my talk, the comparison of CG and stock flow models. So we used mainly the work of some Australian economists for the financial CGE, and the work of Sebastian and Marco for SFC weight input output. These can be compared with different accounts. So the accounting structure has to be consistent always, but it is not necessarily true that CG models are consistent in a sense which is also relevant for empirical work, because basically CGE are, as the name says, Computable General Equilibrium models, and they use maximization and sometimes forward-looking behavior. So usually you assume that the end period value of a stock is that which maximizes your utility and your decisions, and therefore your flows are are such that the stock, the end of period stock, will be in equilibrium. So yes, you have consistency, but this consistency has basically no effect, no feedback on other behavior of your model. Maybe I have to add the stock consistency. Some CGE have all CGE have dynamic consistency for investment decision. Usually, so the stock of capital in the economy increases with net investment. But I doubt that they have this dynamic for all the financial assets. For data, this is another important issue. Most CGE don't use time series. They use a starting social accounting matrix, then a number of assumptions on how this can evolve through time, but they don't rely on time series. Empirical stock flow models, on the other hand, require time series. So one of the questions which has already come up yesterday is once we want to introduce the input-output matrix, which is available only for one year, then another year after some time, will we be able to keep this adherence to time series data, or will stock flow models, as I think Sebastian has done, use only one period when doing the calibration, and therefore become more similar to CGE models. Other differences, obviously, are theory. CGE models are usually determined by supply. But when I discuss with my co-author, who is the real expert on CGE, he tells me, look, the CGE approach, as the mainstream approach, is very flexible. So the idea that I teach to my students is that microeconomics is about an imaginary world in which we define the rules of behavior, and the purpose of studying it is that it will give us the optimal amount of happiness for everyone. Then you can introduce the deficiencies that move from the theoretical imaginary world to the real world, and you have a large flexibility in doing that. So you can add discrepancies, whatever non-competitiveness, irrational behavior, you name it, and your model will become more realistic. So you can, this is also true for CGE models. My co-author tells me that you have CGE models where you have unemployment in equilibrium, that you may have disequilibrium, so they are very flexible. For CGE models, here we have to make some distinctions. I told you that most of them are post-Keynesians, and obviously being a post-Keynesian myself, I think that this is one of the reasons why they were more effective than mainstream models when in times of crisis. Do we always stick to the post-Keynesian theory when doing empirical work? And the answer is no, and mainly because the Stockholm models adopt the Tobin's approach to portfolio allocation of equities and financial assets, and this is not what you find in the data. So the CGE, SFC models have become more pragmatic in their approach. But in any case, SFC models are out of equilibrium models. So I think that this is the key distinction with the CGE approach. As I see it, if we keep fixed coefficients, then the SFC approach combined with the input-output will remain post-Keynesian in a way. If we want the coefficients to change and we want the theory for driving the change, then it's more likely that CGE approach will prevail. What I also find extremely important is, as I already said, is that these SFC models are very useful to check the data. So once you add also the input-output structure, you have another layer of consistency that you can verify. Now, yesterday, Jackson was suggesting to have balance sheet data for firms. So if this is feasible, then you can also have another layer of consistency between the data on firms' balance sheet and the data for the institutional sector balance sheets. Finally, this is my last slide. I think that the two approaches will not converge. Maybe it will convince some CGE modelers to add consistency in their stocks, but I doubt that they will shift to an approach where their model is not getting to the optimal equilibrium in a relatively short amount of time. So the discussion between mainstream and Keynesian, post-Keynesian, ruffians, you name it, will continue on this ground. This is my personal opinion. I'm optimistic because with each crisis, the post-Keynesians show that some parts of the mainstream is wrong, and the mainstream recognize it with a lag. The last obvious example is the supply of money in the central bank. Now, Blanchard, for instance, has changed his textbook to say that the central bank does not control the money supply, but only the interest rate. And this has many implications. So, in a sense, we could even say that saving no longer determines investment, because if the central bank can set the interest rate, and banks can create whatever amount of money at the interest rate which is demanded, then you can have an expansion and create saving from the amount of investment, as in the standard Keynesian approach. So slowly, my prediction is that textbooks will be changed in our direction, and possibly our approach will gain popularity. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonardo, for your very nice presentation. And we have some questions from the floor.
Yes, thanks a lot for this very nice presentation. Yeah, as you said, it's true, CGE can be quite flexible in the way you have when you have a model in general equilibrium, that it means basically you have a Luther definition which could be opposed to partial equilibrium, which means basically demand is homogeneous and supply also, so they influence each other. And in this case, indeed, you can have, basically what the main difference is basically you have a determination of quantity and prices. And I would say the main, and it's true, often CGE or general equilibrium models, they miss the consistency with the stock flow, they're more in flow, although you could add that, so it's not, but you could argue also that SFC models, sometimes I've read some of them, they miss a little price setting. I mean, they consider price as exogenous, so you could say that's also the inconsistency, because if you develop a model only on stock, but the stock have no impact on prices, in a way. So I guess I see a possibility of convergence, but basically general equilibrium model has to take more of the consistency of the stock flow, and maybe the stock flow should also take inspiration of how they could be more consistent in terms of price setting, because that's quite important in economic theory, whether you do it in an equilibrium or in a disequilibrium framework, non-Keynesian or post-Keynesian. So yeah, that was a remark on the sense of presentation.
Thank you very much for the questions. So first, I have not used partial equilibrium. Partial equilibrium is usually when you don't consider some markets and you only consider a subset in equilibrium. Stock flow consistency usually considers all markets, but they're never all in equilibrium.
So they're general disequilibrium.
Yeah, they are moving over time. Yes. On prices, I, in a sense, disagree, because you are right that prices are not modeled in most SFC models, And this was because inflation was not an issue until last year. So for the empirical work we have done models for the US, for Greece, for Italy, and for Ecuador. And in all of our models, we do have a very good tracking of macroeconomic data. We model import prices, export prices, and domestic prices, but not the link to wages and prices. But this is not to say that we are not willing to do that. It's just so that from the empirical point of view, at the aggregate level, inflation was flat for many years. And you know that if you need to estimate the determinants of something which is flat, usually it gets lower. Now that inflation is moving, it would be easy.
Yeah, but it's interesting also to have a price, to understand returns, rate of return. You have a central bank, so in the return of your stock, probably depend on the state of the stock of the economy, obviously, employment. So yeah, I guess, but you would make, it would be good to have SFC put more price behavior, I would say. That's my personal view. Thanks.
Yes.
The kind of question, comments, let me try to organize my ideas. So, thank you for the presentation. So, we start. So, kind of improved CGE model, CGE, the model used to add in this account.
Really?
Really?
That's a joke?
No, it's all the things attached to the Wi-Fi started to. Wi-Fi is exploding.
Can I? So interesting because the CGE model kind of model and in the capital account, in the organization where savings equal to gross, saving equal to investment, and in this kind of model, end of the story. So, but the stock flow model, the balance sheet, by the net lending position, and they have to go to the financial asset relationship. And there are the points that are relevant to connect these two fields. One is the liquidity constraint in the financial sector. So when you can manage the liquidity constraints in the financial sector very well with stock account, but not in the CGE, because you don't have the connection. And this plays an important role in the finance process of the demand-driven of investment in the infra model. So if you don't connect these dots, you are missing a lot of information. And this is why many models in the financial crisis doesn't work well, because they were not connecting properly the liquidity constraint that the financial sector lived in that time. So if you can connect these, are great. So thank you for push the people to use this. And the other point is that the return of the income of the financial sectors are an important component of the secondary income of this type of model. So it's not only the value added generated by the input operations that determine the financial the consumption of the use of the income of the household and friends, because it's also the property income from the financial sector. Now, in the CGE model, these are not connected at all. You are using all the channels, the important channels of transmission between the financial sector and so you're right. So we need to connect the stock flow with income at all. And thank you. And this is my comment. And my question is, what if you get a data set with input-output data and information of sectors like income distribution and information like capital and financial, all balanced in one bunch database for a time series for many countries in what have you do with this?
Well, that would be the optimal amount of information we want. So yes, the target is to get to this type of data. And basically this is what also is happening slowly at the international level, because all these accounts are recommended in the SNA 2008. So countries are slowly implementing them. There is a lot of work still to be done, but the quality of this data, I think, will improve. As I said also, if central banks and statistical institutes adopted the accounting part of the software models, also the quality of their data would improve considerably. We have found in Greece and in Italy, sometimes in the US, that running the accounting of the software model on the data, we found some inconsistency. We wrote to the guy producing the data, and they thanked us and fixed the problem. So anyway, for whatever else you said, I agree. I don't know exactly what you mean by financial constraints, but one of the interesting results I had working in Ecuador, which is a dollarized country, where people at the central bank were trained in the US with the idea that there's a money multiplier and that the amount of money that could be generated was a multiple of the dollars that was exogenously poured into the country. And I set the model so that money was endogenously determined, which was what was happening in Ecuador at the time. And basically, they were getting the dollars they needed by getting the transactions in oil with China, so the straight channel. But anyway, if you need to have money, you can have money in some way. And also in a dollarized country, this demand-led money market work better than the money supply. By the way, in Ecuador, when they changed the government and they stopped doing this transaction with China, they went bankrupt.
Okay, I think we are running out of time, so please,
Luis is a specialist on building financial science, if I'm not mistaken, so he's leading the frontier in developing this type of data set, which would be very useful for our community. So
Yeah, my question was probably because the good news is that the next year we are going to extend the field tables to the capital account and onto the financial account. So
We can talk about
with the full balance. So it's going to be available in your stack. So
Thank you.
thank you very much.
thank you very much.